Right, welcome to week 2 of GV311, both for students on the course and for those from outside. Those of you who were here last week will know we're running this course very much as a normal course, but we've opened it out as well to invite people from outside the school in addition to those who are on GV311. And this second week takes us into philosophy, ideas and British politics. I'm Tony Travers, who's director, I can say that. And this is week 2, which will give us an insight into the philosophy and ideas that underpin British politics. So what you hear this week are the roots that will act both as the underpinning for the constitution we'll hear about next week, but more generally, all of those things that you hear politicians talk about will, to one degree or another, have a root, or not have a root, in what you're going to hear about this week, and Paul Kelly's going to talk about that. And indeed, the lecture is to begin by Professor Paul Kelly, who is Professor of Political Theory in the Government Department and also one of the school's pro-directors. So he's going to speak for a while. At the end of that, he and I will open up the discussion, and you'll have an opportunity to ask questions and join in yourself as well.
Thank you very much, Tony. I didn't bring a glass of water, so I'm going to go on for a long time until I dry up, and then I'm going to stop. But I may dry up before I get to the end. Okay, I'm going to talk about philosophy, ideas, and British politics. What I'd like to do first, if you'll indulge me, is to spend about 10 minutes just saying something about ideas and philosophy and so on. Once upon a time, if you were studying British politics, you would have studied British political ideas as part of it. If you were studying political ideas, you would have also studied those as part of a national tradition. Okay, many of you, some faces are familiar, will have studied political theory in LSE, and you'll note that you tend to do courses that look like, you know, the Western canon, Plato to NATO, where the study of political ideas is taken away from national contexts. Alongside that, there are courses on political philosophy which tend to be about who should get what. So contemporary disputes about justice is one of the sort of staples of advanced level courses in political philosophy. All of those courses tend to sort of separate out, as I say, the discussion of political ideas from the traditions and so on within which those ideas are potentially formed. We see the rise of moralism. Moralism separating out the issues that political philosophy can deal with from political institutions, national traditions, institutional contexts, and so on. So what I'm going to do, in a sense, is actually quite old-fashioned. What I'm going to do is bring back some ideas or some thinkers that have been familiar in the discussions of courses you may have taken, but look at them within the context of a course on British politics with a view to illuminating, hopefully, the debates that you're going to cover in subsequent lectures, as Tony says. Now, I'm not going to do that in a primarily historical way, because the other thing that one does with the history of political ideas in view of the rise of moralism is to turn them back into historical artifacts. So the only questions you ask about political thinkers is, what was the current social context within which their ideas emerged? You ask essentially historical questions of what become historical texts. Now, fantastic tradition of interpretation associated with Cambridge scholars like Quentin Skinner makes a lot of that. But I think they also lose something that's quite important. So if the lecture has a kind of moral, it's going to be to try and say something along the lines of there's scope for rethinking the study of political ideas, as I say, in relation to traditions of politics itself. Now, that idea of tradition is something that we'll come back to. So that's my pitch. Just to say, you know, that this isn't just the concerns of a political philosopher who's trying to show that he's still relevant in the political science canon, do they matter? Well, here are two important figures who are going to be part of the story. The elderly gentleman in the monochrome shot is Michael Oakeshott. Some of you may have heard of Michael Oakeshott, some not. The other is Michael Friedan. Michael Friedan is still alive. He's emeritus professor in politics at Oxford. He's moved to Nottingham, post-retirement, I suppose. Why are these guys interesting? Well, they theorise politics. So in a sense, they provide the intellectual frameworks that I'm going to use to say some things about politics. But are they only of concern to people like myself, professional political thinkers? Well, Oakeshott is a very important English political philosopher. He taught at LSE, so his home team. That's another reason for celebrating him, from 1951 to 68. He shaped a generation of political thinkers across the political spectrum. That's true. But he's also a close friend of Shirley Letwin. Both are now deceased, a political thinker and historian of political thought in her own right. But the name might give something away. Shirley Letwin, of course, is the mother of Oliver Letwin. Oliver Letwin, as you will know, is MP for West Dorset, Minister of State in the Cabinet Office, one of the key sources of the intellectual coherence of the Conservative government's project. And Oliver Letwin is quite explicit about the influence that he's drawn from Oakeshott's ideas. Okay, so Oakeshott is sort of implicated in British politics in an important way. He was also involved in rethinking conservative ideas in the 1970s, which had an impact in some respects in the way in which conservatism as an ideology in Britain developed. And most recently, he's been picked up by another MP, Jessie Norman, the MP for Hereford and South Herefordshire, who seems to be everywhere at LSE with Maurice Glassman talking about the big society versus blue Labour, or promoting later on in the term in a public lecture his new book on Edmund Burke. Now that's why I think these things are important. So there's a family connection here. The other character, Michael Friedan writes these incredibly complex books like Ideologies and Political Theory, which some of you might have to look through the ideas of. There you'll read about Louis Althusser and Antonio Gramsci and Lyotard and lots of other very important people. But Friedan is also important because Friedan has been part responsible for a trend in the study of political ideas in Britain to shift the focus away from questions about justice, questions about moralism, and to look at the way in which ideologies work in practice. Amongst his eminent students, Mark Steers. Mark Steers is a great friend of Ed Miliband. Mark Steers is the source of One Nation Labour. So these guys have a direct impact on the ideological debates, the way in which political argument takes place in Britain now. So, yes, ideas matter. They matter perhaps, interestingly, more to politicians, practitioners, than they matter to some academics who see them as being sort of epiphenomenal and separated out from the way politics is done. If you do political science, you'll want to look at what the real causes of actions, interests, and so on are. And ideas are kind of stuff that, follows along later. But they are central to the way in which politics is done. And that's the bit I want to focus on. So let me turn to Oakeshott first. Three elements here. It's the philosophy, practice, tradition are the things that I want to pick out. Okay? Oakeshott is concerned with distinguishing a philosophy, a political philosophy, what kind of thing it is. He asks himself in his theory a very, very important question, not just about the study of politics, but certainly about the study of political ideas. What is the role of the academy, the university, in studying political ideas? Is it my job in teaching you political theory to get you to believe in a particular theory of justice, a view about what rights you should have, what kind of constitution there should be? Oakeshott's point is to try and separate out those prescriptive normative questions from broader philosophical questions. Philosophy is reserved for something special, an integrated and coherent account of the totality of experience. Wonderfully abstract idea, but philosophies provide a kind of framework within which political experience makes sense. Now, the question that Oakeshott then presents is, where do those philosophies come from? Okay, one can sort of pick them off the shelf and just impose them onto the world. But Oakeshott goes back to a very important idea that he takes from Hegel. And Hegel's argument, I won't go into it in great detail, but Hegel's argument is important because what Hegel tries to do is to provide an account of the way in which concepts emerge. And Hegel locates that story within an account of history. So concepts emerge in political contexts. They provide the conscious ordering of experience. The real is the rational and the rational is the real. Don't trouble yourself with the backstory to that. But the point that Oakeshott, following Hegel, wants to make is that ideas are not arbitrary. Philosophical concepts are not arbitrary. They arise in certain places and they do certain work. They are actually linked to institutions, traditions of practice, because those are the things through which politics manifests itself. And then the question is, well, how do we identify institutions? How do we identify the kinds of things that we should study? We bring them under concepts, and those concepts are either coherent or they're not, and that's what the philosopher can tell us about. Bringing experience under a concept identifies things such as which bits of what we count as the state counts as the state. Is it everything? Is it simply what happens in Parliament? Why do we focus on Parliament in the way we do? How do we separate out different levels of government? Who is it that constitutes a people? What is it that makes, in a sense, the experience of politics what it is? These overarching philosophical approaches try and give us some steer on that. I'm going to come on in a minute to three sort of representative figures who give us those kinds of visions. Practice is important because for Oakeshott, doing politics is important. What we're understanding is an activity that generates its own understandings. So you can't do the philosophy, in a sense, wholly independently of practice. You can't do it wholly independently of traditions of conduct. Okay, otherwise you just end up inventing arbitrary constructions, or you start wishing for things. And that's the other important thing about the idea of practice in Oakeshott's vision. What we have to do in understanding is we have to follow the way traditions of inquiry create ideas, understandings of institutions and so on, not simply impose on the world things we want to see there. Right? And that's a constant task for us. Of course, it's not a problem if you're doing politics. You can impose any ideas you like on experience because you've got a different kind of test. But when we're trying to do political science or study politics, we want to be careful that we don't just impose our own preconceived values or wishes on the bits that are important or the bits that are unimportant. So practice matters. It matters more in terms of doing politics than in the understanding of politics, but it's important that we understand what the practice of politics is. And then traditions are very important. Traditions just mean the context within which human conduct is understood. Okay? Everything happens within some context. The task is to identify the parameters of that context. And at the most general level, we want to link this with everything. But in thinking about British politics, we want to establish what the appropriate context is. And it can involve trivial things like, does the context have territorial, geographical territorial, physical boundaries? Does the state end at Dover? or is it more complex than that? Frieden takes a rather different view, but it's in the same broad vein. So he's concerned with the study of ideologies. Okay? Ideologies for Oakeshott are nasty, partial perspectives that people who really shouldn't be teaching at university bring to try and persuade their students to be communists or conservatives or something like that. Whereas Frieden is actually interested in the way in which ideology works. For him, it's not a subcategory of political thinking less good than philosophy. Philosophy is this sort of superior activity, and ideology is the kind of messy stuff that not very sophisticated thinkers do. So he's against the view that says we should read John Rawls or some other very grand political philosopher and ignore what Jesse Norman or Roger Scruton or anybody like that thinks, because after all they're just pushing an angle. His point is that all thinking about politics is ideological. It brings with it perspectives. Okay? It's situated in a dynamic world, as I say here, of changing political experience. So the other important point that Frieden brings to the story is that ideologies are dynamic things that change. So when we think about political ideologies and the way in which they shape agendas, we have to see that part of our understanding of those ideologies is to see them as dynamic and changing, rather than having a single authoritative statement. So socialism is not one thing given for all time. It's actually a more complex construction that develops, and the task is to try and understand how it develops. And of course he goes on to suggest ways in which we can bring in other great thinkers. He refers to Karl Marx, Karl Mannheim, who taught briefly again at the LSE, Antonio Gramsci, who didn't, he fortunately died in prison, and Louis Althusser, who killed his wife, which is not relevant, but he did actually kill his wife, to explain the importance about the ineradicability of ideological thinking. So it's everywhere, it's transformative. What we want to do is to try and understand the ways in which it transforms, and also perhaps raise the significance in our understanding of institutions of the way in which political argument is actually the argument of those engaged in politics, not some abstract realm of philosophers outside of the world of political experience. So those are the two perspectives. Let me then jump on to an illustrative story. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a number of important philosophers. I say philosophers in British politics because how British they are, of course, is itself an interesting question, particularly when we get to Edmund Burke. Is he British? He's certainly not English, but in a way he possibly is. He's also Irish. Adam Smith will get a mention in the story. So, what is British politics, again, is ambiguous, as indeed the boundaries of the British state at the moment are ambiguous, and what it will look like in a year's time or after a certain vote matters. So what I'm going to do is to give you three perspectives. They are arbitrary. Okay, I've picked the ones that I think are helpful. The challenge of political thinking is to see whether these are coherently separable. Do we learn anything from using them? Could we bring in others that make the story clearer? But this is the sort of illustrative bit about how one thinks about politics through an extant tradition and uses ideas to explain things. So let me start with perhaps the most famous, important English political philosopher, Thomas Hobbes. It states there 1588 to 1672. And I have a lovely quote from Michael Oakeshott. The greatness of Hobbes is not that he began a new tradition, but that he constructed a political philosophy that reflected the changes in the European intellectual consciousness. Now the Europe word is important here. Leviathan, like any masterpiece, is an end and a beginning. It's a flowering of the past and a seed box for the future. So Oakeshott is suggesting that Hobbes brings together certain things which were current at the time, puts them into a coherent framework within which we can see how certain political institutions form themselves. Obviously, we're talking about the state in Hobbes's case, but also how this has a bearing on how that develops over time. So, Hobbes writes from the Spanish Armada through to the exclusion crisis, prior to the Glorious Revolution. He translates Thucydides. He does various useful kinds of things. His most important book, Leviathan, which was published in 1651, has this. I'm just going to put this up because it's important. It's the frontispiece of the book, and it's a pictorial representation of his conception of the state. Okay? It's deliberately designed, and the image is to reflect an ideological purpose to those who probably couldn't read or understand or be bothered to work their way to the end of the story. This is a representation of what sovereignty is. How sovereignty is created out of something. So it's not a natural thing. It's created. The sort of scruffy little scraggy bits underneath the king's head, if you look carefully, are people looking towards the crown. So the body politic, that's what he's talking about. The body politic is constituted by individuals who come together as one thing when brought under a single head. A single head, which is that of the sovereign, represented here as a kind of monarch, but he's talking about sovereignty as a concept, not as an individual, and that head brings with it various things. Single judgment and a single will, two elements of a person, okay? Whatever else, okay, we get postmodern about this and maybe you don't have a single will or a personality or something. But for Hobbes, these are defining features of what it is to be a person. And what he's concerned with is what makes the state into a person that has an identity that can be individuated and separated from something else, and a will. Because an important feature of sovereignty is that it is a single declared will. When you don't have a single declared will, as he found in the English Civil War, you have chaos and disorder. Out of disorder, we would always make order. That's basically Hobbes' story. And the other stuff below, church and state, army, torturing instruments that of course bishops use, and bishops getting ready to torture somebody, that's apparently what they do. But the important message is that the military arms of the state, church, or any other institution are below the sovereign. The sovereign is in charge. Okay? And when you've got a sovereign in charge, you have this wonderful society. Beautiful buildings, gardens laid out, fantastic stuff, all there below the watchful gaze of the sovereign. So, Hobbes' view, briefly. Hobbes is a rationalist. The story of Leviathan is about the rational construction of the state. He's a methodological individualist, he's a constructivist, and he's an egoist. He's an egoist in the sense that he regards people as fundamentally self-interested. Whatever else they want, they are concerned about their own wants over and above everything. Now, if you read Leviathan, the first important part is the state of nature. The natural condition out of which political society emerges is what he calls a war of all against all. If there was no order, we would fight each other all of the time. Not because we're nasty, but because we would just come into conflict. Our ends are not naturally harmonious. Okay? We all want things at the same time. We have equality of power. There's scarcity of supply. We can't have all the things we want all of the time. We're actually a little bit concerned about what others have, so if others have more than us, we want it. You know, if someone's got a smartphone, you want a similar kind of smartphone. You don't want what's good enough, you want what's best, what distinguishes you from others. That's an important part of Hobbes' story. He's an individualist. We saw that in the picture. The state is composed of individuals primarily. And he's a constructivist. The state, political institutions, importantly, are constructed out of the wills of persons. So the key ordering concepts for Hobbes are will and artifice. Okay? They're familiar ideas going right back to the ancient Greeks, but will is the crucial thing that drives his politics. Not reason, although reason has an important part in the story, but it's will. The law is simply the imposed will of a sovereign, and states are artificial. Now, there's a number of things there. The state is something that we create, or if it didn't exist, we would create, so we always have a reason to submit to it. But also reminding us that it's an artifice, we are mindful of the fact we can break it quite easily. So we need to be careful about that too. It's an artificial entity willed into being to secure order. And the problem of order, as I say, derives from our competitive individual natures. So what are we left with then as the crucial takeaway points in Hobbes' story? Sovereignty, it is unified and indivisible. Okay? There can be, and this is a logical point, not a practical point, there can be no logical division or separation of powers. If you divide sovereignty, you destroy it. Okay? And this is a logical point, because if you have to arbitrate between conflicting powers, you have to identify some mechanism, some place, some point at which that arbitration takes place. And Hobbes' point is that will always be your sovereign. Okay? So if you have a constitution with powers and the constitution and the president come into conflict and the Supreme Court arbitrates, Hobbes' point is the Supreme Court is sovereign. It's not shared, it's in one place. Okay? Whoever exercises that power of decision is the sovereign. And a political order must have that. Secondly, law is the sanctioned will of a sovereign. I've just mentioned that. So law has jurisdictional limits. The sovereign, in a sense, wills and sanctions the law, and he can only do that as far as his power extends. So law isn't something that exists independently of sovereignty. There's no law, if you like, of the Constitution that's outside and determines what the Constitution should look like. Consequently, Hobbes is anti-republican. Government is of, and it's for the people, but it's not by the people. So the crucial point here is that the sovereign shouldn't be arbitrary. The sovereign should be aware of acting in a way that maintains stability and successful government. A sovereign would not want to destroy the conditions of sovereignty. But the crucial point is the sovereign is the judge of what's appropriate. That's where we get absolutism from. Hobbes is an absolutist in the sense of saying sovereignty has to be absolute, without question, beyond challenge, for it to work. Now that isn't the same as being, as taking everybody's property. Sovereign can do that, but pragmatically it might not be a very good idea to do that. But there is no sort of right or legal limitation on what the sovereign can do. Sovereignty is the source of its own terms. Once it loses that, it ceases to be sovereignty. So you can already see how this matters. Okay? It's not something that can be shared. Okay? You can't give up sovereignty with a view to taking it back at a later time. You can't share it with the European Union. Okay? Because you give it up. It's a sort of zero-sum game. And then finally, liberty is sacrificed in order for security under the law. So Hobbes is not a liberal. Hobbes is not interested in protecting the rights of citizens. A successful sovereign will try and do that. But citizens, subjects of a sovereign power, have no claim to be treated in any particular way by government power. Okay, government power decides what's appropriate to secure order. Okay? Now, I put up a big quote here from Hayek on Hobbes' legacy. I'm not going to read the whole thing out. But the very end, Hayek is important for our story because Hayek too is a very influential contemporary figure in political ideas. But Hayek characterizes Hobbes's position in a certain kind of way. This approach is derived from the new rationalist philosophy developed above all by René Descartes, but also by Thomas Hobbes in Britain. Now, the implication that comes out of this is that Hobbes is actually kind of alien. He brings into British politics, English politics of the time, ideas that are actually continental. So Hobbes's position is ambiguous. Continentals are happy with absolutism. That's a French invention. Okay? They're happy with the rational ordering of freedom and so on. Hayek is suggesting for contemporaries that if we follow a kind of Hobbesian model of the state, we're bringing in something that is actually alien to our tradition. Now, I'll leave you to decide later on in your discussions how alien it is, but that's an important issue. Okay? What is Hobbes' legacy? Now, I just like Jeremy Bentham because I wrote a book on him a long, long time ago. Jeremy Bentham lives in a box at University College London. If you have not seen him, go and see him because he does actually sit in that box. Bentham is a radical of sorts. But I bring him in because Bentham has a very important place in the story of the 19th century development of British government. Okay, the utilitarians and the philosophic radicals who worked around Bentham were very, very important in shaping the modern British state. And sometimes the sort of overarching idea of British or the governing philosophy of Britain is seen to be this kind of utilitarian view. Bentham brings that. He criticises people like Sir William Blackstone. Maybe Martin will talk about Blackstone next week. Blackstone codifies the English common law. Bentham criticises it. But Bentham is important for our story because he's partly the conduit through which Hobbes's ideas arrive in the emergence of the recognisably modern British state in the 19th and early 20th century. One of Bentham's followers, Sir Richard Molesworth, was the person who put together the first full collected works of Hobbes in the 1840s. So the philosophic radicals took Hobbes as part of their story, partly because Bentham, although holding liberal views in other respects, took on board this commitment to sovereignty that Hobbes presents, the idea of the indivisibility of sovereignty. He rejects in his constitutional thinking views like, the separation of powers or constitutional limitations. He criticises the US Constitution precisely because it contains logical flaws, things that make it not work. But he combines this, as I say, with being committed to the greatest happiness of the greatest number. So here we have benign experts in government exercising political power for the benefit of those who are governed. That's fine. Using the criterion of the greatest happiness of the greatest number. But when it comes to his legal theory, he's a positivist and he adheres to this important view of sovereignty. And Bentham too is often criticised for being rather alien, a bit too French for the British political tradition. Okay, so that's the rationalist tradition, sovereigntist tradition. Hobbes represents that. Second, Locke, the mixed constitution. I'm also going to bring in Tom Paine as part of this story. Locke is one of my favourite thinkers for no good reason, but he just is. He's the author of a number of very, very important works, an essay concerning human understanding, 2 treatises on government, letter on toleration, reasonableness of Christianity. He creates a liberal conception of politics. Okay? And his range of interests in philosophy is much, much broader than Hobbes. What does Locke say? Well, interesting quote very early on. Political power, then, I take to be the right of making laws with penalties of death and consequently all less penalties for the regulating and preserving of property and the employing of the forces of the community in the execution of such laws and in the defence of the Commonwealth from foreign injury, and all this only for the public good. How does this differ from Hobbes? Well, the important point that that animates the Lockean view is a constrained conception of politics. Politics is about doing these things. Okay, so he's setting out what politics is about. Whatever else government does, whatever else politics, all it really ought to do is to use its power to make laws to regulate the public good in this kind of way, primarily seen in terms of preserving property and employing the forces of community. So Locke presents us with a challenge to the sovereigntist view of Hobbes. Okay? For Hobbes, sovereignty is the solution. For Locke and the tradition that follows from him, sovereignty is the problem. The location of sovereignty in a single-sightedness. Okay? The executive above all else. That's what Locke is concerned with. He's concerned with it partly for historical reasons, because James II was kind of keen on this Hobbesian idea of absolutism, so long as he was the one exercising the power. Locke is less keen on this. So Locke's view is about mixed government, about the balance of forces at the heart of government, to see the constitution, in a sense, as a series of intricate balances between different powers. And he then gives us a constitutional tradition where sovereignty is divided between legislative, executive, not judiciary, he calls it federative, but it's actually foreign affairs, because sovereignty, as I say, is not the solution, it's actually the problem. And that we see in a lot of debates consequently about constitutional reform. We see up to now, what should be done to rein in the powers of the executive? How do the powers of the executive fit together with the legislature? How do we define the legislative in the UK Constitution? What's the role of the checking authority of the Lords? Should it be elected? How does it fit together, given that we situate our executive within the legislature, and so on? Locke ought to take us to clearer separation of these things. Okay? So all of those people who are interested in the reform of the Constitution, clarifying constitutions and so on, in a sense fit into this Lockean narrative. They're not concerned with representing institutions as they find them, they're concerned with changing them towards certain goals. And those goals are shaped by the fact that we think of political society as a contract. Hobbes is a social contract theorist, Locke is a social contract theorist. But Locke's contract creates limited government. It sees this contract not as a one-off alienation of our powers to the sovereign that he then uses whenever he wants, but something that we set up. Political society is set up as an agreement, and the terms under which political authority is exercised is an agreement. It's a trust that is exercised through a set of institutions to do certain specified things, not just anything. So the nature, the limits of government authority depend on consent, not simply on what the sovereign decides is best. So we move towards the idea of government not only being for, but also by the people. Now, Montesquieu comes in here. I just thought Montesquieu takes this idea of separation of powers as a very British achievement, an English achievement. And he's sort of following on from Locke. Actually, Locke doesn't have a separation of powers in a strict sense. That we only find properly later on in the Federalist Papers when we're looking at the development of the United States Constitution. But Locke is at least aware of the problem of constraining and limiting the power of sovereignty. Montesquieu picks that up, but he makes it clear what's at stake. Okay? Three powers, Political liberty in a citizen is that tranquility of spirit which comes from the opinion one has of his security, and in order for him to have this liberty, government must be such that one citizen cannot fear another. When legislative power is united with executive in a single person or single body, there is no freedom, there's no liberty. Because those who set the laws interpret those laws and execute those laws. There's no liberty of judgment, and that brings out the contrast primarily with the Hobbesian view. Paine, I just wanted to bring at the end because Paine is a kind of radical Lockean. Paine is writing at the end of the 18th century. He writes a book, The Rights of Man, 1791, which is partly a response to Burke's critique of the French Revolution. Paine takes up the ideas of the Lockean constitution, that we have certain fundamental rights, that these rights are things we can discover through the exercise of our reason, not because of being part of any particular tradition or history, but our reason wherever. So those rights are universal, they are the rights of man as such, and that these set the parameters of constitutional decisions. Now, one of the important points that Paine brings to the story is that in order to think about a constitution, we need a document. We need a constitutional act that specifies who is the we, that governs itself in a certain kind of way, and under what terms that we is identified. Without that, we can't think about questions of the appropriate nature of government and so on. Okay, move on quickly. The third tradition I want to look at is a traditionalist one of Adam Smith and Edmund Burke. Burke is a fantastic writer in many ways, a wonderful parliamentarian, a challenging thinker from the political writer, a figure that people go back to constantly. But his ideas fit together rather nicely with Adam Smith. And I want to pick this one up because it also takes us into another way of thinking about how a political tradition develops. Okay? The rationalists start with certain building blocks. So Hobbes starts with individuals and how individuals build themselves into a bigger, complex story. And if we use that model, we can think about what works, what doesn't, how we should think about the appropriate form of government. What these traditionalists do is take living traditions as providing the context within which individuals exercise their rights and liberties. So in a sense, we start with community, we start with tradition. Now Smith is very interesting for us. Smith wrote some lectures on jurisprudence which he gave in Glasgow. They weren't actually published properly. They weren't published properly until 1976, although there was an edition that appeared in the early 19th century. But what Smith does is provide us with a kind of anthropological account of how government arises, okay? How it develops through various stages to achieve certain kinds of things. Now, that evolutionary process is important because that is, in a sense, the accumulated wisdom of a society as it develops through various kinds of stages. So what we want to do in understanding who we are and what the possibilities facing us are is to understand the process out of which our politics has actually emerged. Unlike social contract theory, there is no point at which we just made a state. Okay? There is no sort of state of nature and then, in 1793, the state appeared and there wasn't anything before there. There's a long process. History matters, okay? And the history is embodied in institutions. So Smith is an anti-rationalist. He believes reason is dispersed through those elements of the story. And the other important thing, and this matters for later liberal theory and conservative philosophy and so on, is the idea that freedom is not simply constituted by a set of rights. So all of those people who think that freedom is simply a set of human rights, for example, brought into law, miss the point. Freedom is constituted by certain institutional practices because those practices ensure that whatever we then identify as rights are maintained. Just to go back to Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham, being a radical and a Democrat, was also vehemently opposed to the rights of the talk about the rights of man. Why? Partly because he thought that doctrines of rights, declarations of rights, always needed to be interpreted. And that was a focus for politics. So to pretend that you can solve politics by appeal to a set of rights misses the fact that interpreting those rights is itself a fundamentally political act. Think about modern debates about the European Convention on Human Rights. Okay, fantastic document, sets out various kinds of things, solves all sorts of problems, but for Bentham, it's just politics. And if it is just politics, you have to ask the question of whose politics it is. What's going on in the interpretation of those rights? A similar kind of view is shared by our own dear Conor Gearty here, in terms of his take on the way in which human rights legislation works. You know, he's a left critic of human rights discourse precisely for that reason, that we sort of think that we do away with political contestation, where really all we're doing is disguising it or giving it to some people who we really oughtn't to give it to solely, like judges, unelected figures, or Supreme Court justices in the United States, whereas these are actually political questions. All right, so freedom is constituted by a set of institutions and cultural achievements. Let me move on to Burke. Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France is a kind of long essay. It just sort of reflects on how terrible it would be if we followed the foolish advice of people like Paine and tried to shape our constitution in accordance with some pre-established doctrine like a doctrine of rights. Why? Because of his doctrine of prescription. Institutions contain within them the shared wisdom of ages. Okay? And we don't always know what that wisdom is, but we sometimes find out what it is when we destroy those institutions. So there's always a risk there. So that should make us cautious. Okay? Things that have lasted a very, very long time have usually lasted a very long time for a good reason. So our natural response to established institutions should be caution. Okay? He celebrates prejudice. Prejudice we don't generally think of as a good thing, but what he means by prejudice is prejudgment, the things that we then bring to reason to adjudicate. We never just reason, okay? That's basically the point here. We never just reason. We always reason about something. Reason is just, the applied capacities of the mind. Reason always has a content. We reason about something. The idea that you can abstract completely away from the context is impossible. So we need to just recognize that debates are always a mix of content and reason, okay? And prejudgments are the things that we just kind of bring to the panel of reason. Sum up here with the intergenerational contract, partnership not only between those who are living, this is how he views a political tradition, a constitution, but also between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. So he's a classic communitarian in contrast to the individualist Hobbesian or the rights-based individualism of the likes of Locke, radicals, and Paine. Okay? So poles you have radical individualism, rationalism, communitarianism, Burke, and in the middle you have this kind of unstable view, the mixed constitution, the rights of man tradition. And the views people take on these positions is either one or other of the two poles are right or wrong, and they take a view about the incoherence or the instability, perhaps, of the middle position. So those sort of map out three approaches to how we might think about British politics. So sovereignty in the state is connected to society, not a precondition of society. Those are important changes. Okay, last bit, and I'll do this rather quickly. What I wanted to do here was just to show the way in which some of these debates come up in current political arguments, how some of these thinkers are appealed to, and how we think of approaching politics through the idea of a tradition. You've already seen Oakeshott. Oakeshott is a kind of Burkean, but Burke is problematic because he's a kind of he's not a proper philosopher in that respect. Oakeshott is a great scholar of Hobbes, but partly because Hobbes is the archetypal rationalist, and Oakeshott's challenge is to rationalism. Hayek, I mentioned, there's the wonderful quote about the alienness of Hobbes's story. Hayek in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s is trying to defend an English conception of freedom. He calls it liberalism, but let's not just worry about whether it's an ideology here, but a British conception that is different from what it is he thinks generated socialism. He thinks that the continental tradition, with its preoccupation with rationalism, is where we get socialism, and socialism, as he calls it in his final work, is the fatal conceit that explains all of the problems of the 20th century. So he wants to sort of steer the interpretation of the appropriate understanding of the English-British Constitution through the likes of Burke, through the likes of Smith, through the likes of these people who look at society and evolution of society as a way of ensuring freedom. And that idea of a tradition is taken up by a student of Oakeshott's, Jack Greenleaf, late Jack Greenleaf. He wrote this fantastic 4-volume, well actually it's more than 4 volumes because some of the volumes are in 2 parts, but it's a study of the British political tradition. Now, Greenleaf is looking at understanding the dynamic of the British political tradition, i.e. how we get to the state we're in now, the development of British government over the last 150 years, as being organised around a sort of dialectic between 2 poles, individualism and collectivism, okay? And we use those to organise the way in which debate takes place across ideologies. So individualism is not the prerogative of liberals and collectivism is not the prerogative of socialists. Greenleaf's point is that this exists in all of the main ideological traditions and political parties. Okay, you have this individualist collectivist dynamic in conservatism, you have it in liberalism, from classical liberalism to new liberalism, from libertarianism in the conservative tradition to a very collectivist sort of Macmillan kind of almost welfare state tradition of conservatism. This is the way in which we understand the development of political thinking. So tradition is going to be important for the way in which we understand the movements in British politics. Cut the story short and just pick some famous faces. The challenge we currently face, arguably, politicians, political thinkers, is the challenge of neoliberalism. Now, John Gray, again, formerly of this manor, John Gray is a very important political thinker, close to rethinking conservatism in the 1970s. Okay? Gray is an apostle of Hayek, but then changes, and Gray writes this important book in 1998, where he argues that neoliberalism, the sort of conservative free market agenda, is starting to eat itself. What it's doing is undermining the conditions of civility that it needs in order to sustain a free market society. So all of the things you want from Burke, all of the things you want from a conservative order that is tolerant of diversity, but particularly economic freedom, is being undermined by a kind of rationalist libertarianism. So we come back to what are the sources driving contemporary political ideologies, conservative ideologies, so on. Tony Giddens, again, of our manor, the great defender of the third way. The third way is social democracy, British social democracy's attempt to weave its own path between the challenges of market globalization and its impact on communities. Okay, so that's really the tension that I want to finish up with. So we see this issue of classical liberalism, social conservatism, small states, free markets, spontaneous moral orders as part of an ideological tradition. And this forces ideological transformation. So this is the sort of context within which Frieden and those affected by him start to think about where to go with British politics. And I just want to finish off with these two wonderful new Edwardians. It's Jesse Norman, again, who I've mentioned. His first significant book, apart from the one that's on the philosophy of mathematics, was on Michael Oakeshott. He's recently gone on to write about the big society. He's the sort of thinker who sort of underpins the idea of the big society as a way of reorienting conservatism. And then Maurice Glassman, who was the architect of Blue Labour. Again, somebody who picks up the communitarian challenges that are going to face whatever else it is that Labour stands for in the future. Now, I want to finish with those two simply because they bring together some of the ideas that we've looked at up to now. Norman in particular is concerned with the shift of the attention of conservatives from, say, the Hobbesian tradition to Burke. He's just written a book on Burke. Burke is the new way for conservatives to think about what conservatism is going to be. What's the organising narrative for conservative politics? Big society didn't quite work, but he's trying to show where some of those ideas come from in this grander tradition. So getting a hearing amongst conservatives for him is important. It's important to link his story to people that all conservatives recognise, Edmund Burke. So if Burke is the architect of the big society, then that's just straight conservatism, no problem. But he's also interested in particular in what's wrong with this anti-Burkean approach. One of his constant targets is the way in which a sort of hyper-individualism, almost Hobbes's view of atomistic, egoistic individuals out for themselves, is an unsustainable politics. Taking up precisely the concerns of Gray earlier, how conservative politics, which is broadly sympathetic to neoliberalism, has to manage the consequences of neoliberalism. Okay? It's easier for someone to reject it and say, well, you know, we just challenge that worldview. But if you are part of a worldview that is broadly sympathetic to that, and you see it as having certain kinds of problems, what is the way forward? And Norman's position is to try and steer us perhaps away from this rather Hayekian libertarian version of conservatism back to something that is equally committed to economic freedom, but in a context that resonates and sustains the conditions of civility, the practices and traditions of our institutions that makes that work. So, why are they Edwardians? And I will stop just here. They're Edwardians partly because they take us back to some of the debates that pre-existed the rise of the British welfare state in the 1930s and 40s. How we can solve some of the problems that globalised world markets present us with, issues about inequality within states, the limits of state power, possible disaggregation of the British Constitution, or the territorial structure of the states. In a sense, they present us with some of the choices that you would have found shaping the politics of the architects of 20th century British state. In a sense, they take us back to those debates that characterised British politics in the 1910s and 20s. Okay, so what I haven't tried to do is to single out one of the philosophical frameworks as the best way, so I've presented you with three. In respect to the development of ideological debate, I haven't covered everything, so it's really only a snapshot. I picked Norman. I could have said more about Tony Giddens or Morris. I could go on endlessly on Maurice Glassman. But it's just to give you a sense of how those ideological debates are still current, still important, and are seen by politicians as part of the way in which they drive forward their political agendas. And in the end, I hope I've tried to show how political ideas, in a sense, impact on, importantly, how we think about things like British politics. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. If I put them on a stage, and apparently this one isn't working. Just try to pick up one or two of those ideas, and please feel free if you want to ask a question or make a comment to do so. You concentrated today, exactly as the course hoped for, on these thinkers who are so important to British government and politics, but presumably, and it was implied in a number of things that you said, that the people you've spoken about themselves were influenced by currents going in France and other parts of continental Europe, so that Rousseau and de Tocqueville and others will have influenced the thinkers that you've spoken about. And again, not asking you to do a whole separate and additional lecture, but in what ways were these people in a time of much less communication, less travel, but they were well travelled in many cases, how were they being influenced by, you mentioned the French Revolution and Burke, but more generally, how far were continental influences, and indeed from the Middle East and beyond, affecting these thinkers?
Well, I mean, British politics is actually quite interesting and important in the way in which it shapes some of the debates that go on, say, in France in particular, in the 18th century. So Montesquieu is a good example. They look to the British Constitution as part of their broad sort of, anthropological, historical, social, scientific perspective on how government works. One of the things Montesquieu is interested in is how, again, politics is specific to a certain kind of location. Now, he gives a naturalistic response to what makes that specific. So in the end, he partly says it's climate. Okay, the climate shapes what you can get away with. You're likely to find more despotism in warmer places. You'll find more freedom in cooler places. And Britain is cool. Northern Europe is a bit like that. So he has that kind of reductionist. So he brings these sort of debates into his experience of the British tradition, brings it into French politics. Rousseau is connected with many important figures. Smith is a correspondent of Rousseau. Rousseau, again, is very interested in the way in which political ideas and the problems of political ideas are contingent and grow up in certain kinds of contexts. So they take British political experience and use it in a certain kind of way. Now, we do something a little bit the same later on. So if you get into the late 19th century, of course, it's German philosophy, which is partly influenced by Rousseau, but then Hegel kicks off, and you have philosophical theories of the state, which then impact on the way in which the British state changes. So it's always back and forth. Okay, there's no single sort of story of influence, and Hegel's philosophic writings reflect on the experience of British radicalism, the development of the British state. He's a very close student of that. Oakeshott, who borrows a lot from Hegel, arguably sort of translates Hegel into an English idiom. But if you were thinking about political philosophy in the early part of the 20th century, you'd be looking at people like Bradley, Bosanquet. Bernard Bosanquet writes The Philosophical Theory of the State. These people shape, these are the original Edwardians, if you like, these people shape ideas about the role of the state, the nature of the welfare state, and so on, and they bring Germanic ideas into their thought. Now, we then go to Austrians, if you like, Hayek and so on, to challenge those traditions later on. The great sort of sources of a return to the British classical liberal tradition are foreigners. Isaiah Berlin, who's a Latvian Jew, Hayek, who's an Austrian, Karl Popper, who wasn't in my story, but another Austrian. I mean, in a sense, it's the foreigners who come in and tell us how to be English and what's special about English. But there's always this sort of fuzziness about the boundaries of a national tradition of political thinking. And that's important too, because it's always an interpretive tradition. There isn't in the end a final story that says, well, this is the British bit, this is the slightly alien bit, and this is outside completely. It's always a dialogue. okay? And that dialogue is perspectival. It depends on the questions, the aspects that you look at, and it changes. Long answer, sorry.
Okay, now good answer. I mean, the other thing that you talked at the end and hinted at a question that certainly interests me, which is that a lot of the thinkers and philosophers that you discussed were writing at a time when the state was very small. I mean, the idea of the state as we know it today is effectively half the economy, the massive machine would have meant nothing to the people writing about the state, sovereignty, and so on. And in that sense, the growth of the state, particularly in the 20th and now 21st century, the scale of the state, radically altered the way these philosophical ideas that will now make sense with the scale of state, that different professionalised epic state compared with the very small one that existed when most of these guys were writing.
Yes. I mean, but remember also that this very, very small state, I mean, think of Burke, for example. The very small state that Burke is talking about includes Ireland. It includes the Church of England. It includes what were then the universities. I mean, the state was more expansive than we sometimes think. There's bits of it that we've now parked. Okay, no one thinks that it's very, very important to have the Church of England. The Church of England was huge in terms of its political power, its control of land, its impact on the distribution of offices. So although we grow the state in a different way in the 19th and 20th century, part of that is transformational. So, those of you who have studied 19th century history and the British Revolution in government, and, was there such a thing, and is there an age of Benthamism, as Dicey says, that story is always an ambiguous story because some of it is transformational. Is it giving up things? Gladstone was partly interested in that, disestablishmentarianism and so on. Bentham was very keen to add things, to take stuff away from other institutions, to bring things into the state. But the state is also a contested concept. So when you move to the likes of Bernard Bosanquet in the late 19th, early 20th century, and he's an important figure because he's against the development of the welfare state, although he influences new liberals who were supportive of the welfare state. He starts to think about the state as a community with a purpose that isn't simply a set of institutional functions. So you could have a comprehensive state that didn't necessarily provide welfare. That could be done through another aspect of the state, but not through government. So charities form part of the state for Bosanquet, but not by absorbing them into the state in what happens later on in the formation of the National Health Service, where individual hospitals, in a sense, are brought under this banner. So, what the state is this sort of contested idea. We know about Parliament. That's easy. We can kind of go downtown and see it, and we know where the law is. But what else is the state? Local government. It's a very, very important part of the state. It's dispersed. Is that centralised? The other important part of the story that it would be a bit difficult to say a huge amount here, but it has a very important bearing on the development of the British state, is the experience of empire. Many of Bentham's followers, important figures in the development of the 19th century state, people like James Fitzjames Stephen, an authoritarian conservative utilitarian, learnt government in India. They learnt about how to develop government, and they brought back the experience of empire. So there's an important story about how the development of the British state from the late 19th century through to the present is the legacy of empire. Utilitarianism is often characterised as government house utilitarianism because, of course, utilitarianism is what benign colonial administrators do to subject populations. They don't brutalise them. That's what the Belgians do in Congo. But we don't really ask them what they want. We give them what we think it's appropriate for them to have. And that's how we approached India.
Okay, would anyone like to ask a question? Feel free, or make a point, as last week. Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask to what extent, and if at all, because at the start somebody, I think Hayek, accused Hobbes of being alien, and this kind of accusation of alien and like not British seems like a theme. And I was wondering to what extent globalization and the fact that today Britain, London in particular, is very multicultural, to what extent that's influenced how we view their legacy, and if that undermines their kind of accusations that it's less valid because it's alien.
Yes. Okay, so the point is about alien impositions from outside and alien ideas and how that relates to, or how relevant that is in a changed world where we have globalization and multiculturalism and so on. I mean, one of the things that Hobbes is trying to do, and Hobbesians are trying to do, is to assert defined sovereignty. Okay? What Hobbes and the rationalists, and Burke, he falls into this category. What they are is they are effectively nationalists. Okay? They see the idea of nation, distinct nation, as being essential to defining a body politic. Whatever else a government is, it rests on the idea of a people, and a people only works if it has some kind of a uniform idea. Okay? Now, the Burkeans go on to say, and that's sort of immanent in our practices and traditions, so you can't bring in an outside idea to constitute it, so that's where Hobbes gets it wrong. But they do still talk about a national, if you like, culture or spirit. So that means that they take a hostile view to challenges to that. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see echoes of that in some contemporary debates about the size and number of immigrants that we can tolerate, problems about multicultural accommodation. Should people who come here assimilate into our traditions, cultures and practices, or do we have an obligation to accommodate those cultures and practices by transforming our traditions? Okay? The Hobbesian rationalist view is kind of open about that. Hobbes's view is simply that the state regulates. Okay? Now, if the state wants to recognise the subsidiary standing of Sharia law, the state can do that. Okay? I mean, the state would decide it applies for family courts and so on, and the state can take it back. So long as that relationship is understood, the state can delegate authority to anybody. Catholic priests can marry people under the law. You could have Sharia law recognised for, family disputes and so on. All of those kinds of things are perfectly consistent with the Hobbesian abstract rationalist view. The only thing you can't have is you can't have shared sovereignty. Okay? So you can't do things because you're required to by Europe or by the United Nations or by anybody else on earth. So you can have quite a benign response to these things, but recognising the fact that these decisions are located in a particular place. And who owns them is going to be the question of stability. So the sovereign is always going to decide what does he have to do to make sure that you own these things. For the tradition that looks at thick conceptions of identity, all of these things are going to be problematic. Bring in multiculturalism, you fragment stuff. Have too many foreigners, you dilute political society. Burke, is constantly aware of that. Partly ironically, he's constantly aware of that because he knows that he's an outsider. So he has to kind of doubly assert the value of belonging. Smith, interestingly, on the other hand, is a cosmopolitan. Smith is the kind of sort of broad, liberal, free trade, open borders kind of person who says, social evolution will accommodate the things we accommodate and it will tell us the things that we can't accommodate. What you can't do is decide those things. People who worry about the death of the state because of too many external pressures, kind of get things wrong. The state doesn't work that way. It's much more a kind of evolutionary process, and it transforms itself. Maybe it transforms itself into something that is more than just a national state. I think actually Smith's view does tend towards some kind of broader set of political institutions and relationships in time, which may or may not have answered your question. But those are my observations on a very important point.
Can well-argued political ideas lead to redistribution of power, or are they just ways for the powerful to support their regime?
Can political ideas lead to the redistribution of political power? If they do, and I suppose this is the big question about the relationship of ideas to politics. If they do, they're going to require some motivation for people to act in a certain kind of way. Now, the ambiguity that we're presented with in these visions is, how do ideas motivate? Okay, if you're given a really, really good idea by Ed Miliband, will you go off and act on it, or by Jesse Norman or whoever? Or is it something that has to resonate with motivations you already have? Now, that issue about where the motivation comes from and how it relates to ideas is the problematic one. Now, philosophers always worry about this question of the motivating conditions. What in your motivational set makes a reason to do something? But I think talking about ideologies is to sort of have a kind of middle position where traditions and so on, within which you're already engaged, try and find a language that brings some of what you already believe to take you into a position that you might not have thought you were committed to or willing to act upon. So Frieden talks about this thing in ideological debate about decontestation. So what ideologies do is they take the fact that in politics we contest things all the time. What does equality mean? Everybody's in favour of equality, but some people think that equality means equality of opportunity in a meritocratic society. Some mean it's the strict appliance of the rule of law and that's the end of it. Others think it's equality of outcome. Others think it... So equality is fine. We all agree on that. Fairness, David Cameron, Ed Miliband, all going to agree on fairness. That's how society should be organised. They disagree about what they think those things entail. So the strategy of decontestation is the attempt to capture language so that you then control the story about it. The task of politics is this process of decontestation, removing the contest from, who owns freedom, so that one group can hold it. And that's partly the question. So if that succeeds, why does it succeed? Well, it succeeds partly because it takes people from something that they're already partly committed to a next stage. It's dynamic. So in that sense, the answer is yes, but it's hard. But they can do it, and that's how you struggle over these issues of language and how that impacts on politics. Chris?
Short and sharp.
Yeah.
Last one, yeah.
I think to answer that question, so in the past you can note very particular political theorists and ideas that link directly into political systems. So Montesquieu was very influential in the American formation.
Yeah.
Went out neoconservatives and neoliberalism had a decisive impact on racism. Do you think that at the moment there is political theory which is very dominating? I mean, do you think there's a contemporary version? I mean, Roger Scruton doesn't seem to decisively disown the Tory party policy, but do you think there's someone they draw on, or do you think it's because you get the criticism it's very ideologically light these days?
Is contemporary political argument in Britain ideologically light? I think you're right. That's true in that final observation. I think that is the worry of some politicians. Now, if one was thinking about, say how New Labour thought about its policy agenda 40, 50 years ago, Tony Crosland picks up, the emerging ideas of this interesting American political philosopher, John Rawls, who has nice things to say about redistribution and the basic structure of society, but he's not a Marxist and so on. So he provides a way for Labour to think about how the welfare state should develop into its next stage. I think the contemporary debate is that sort of statist discourse has kind of run its course, for whatever reason, the collapse of some alternative discourse to, marketisation. We haven't yet got a way of sort of going back to establishing the state as the solution to the problem of the market. Giddens tried to do that. with his third way. That was the point. Neither state nor market, but some kind of clever bit in the middle. But it doesn't quite work. And then the question is, well, what do you do? What do you do next? And I think this is where the focus on civil society has sort of come up. So where will political thinkers, where will politicians look for advice? Maybe not amongst political philosophers now. Maybe those who are more sociologically inclined. You know, the great sort of systematic sociologist Tocqueville, and Tony's already mentioned Tocqueville. You start to look at, you know, the social conditions that sustain a broadly egalitarian order. Now, we know the subsequent history of the United States is anything but egalitarian, but Tocqueville is on to something in terms of where you look. Now, that's an answer that's not necessarily establishing, you know, the rational principles that will take us to a better world. You know, it's not something that you're going to do through the social contract tradition. You may look to some other set of thinkers, and I think that's probably where we're going. We see some of that with the preoccupation with Burke. I mean, Norman, you know, uses Burke to serve his purposes. He tries to say that this is also how Burke should be read, but he uses him for that reason. Unfortunately, Maurice Glassman doesn't have much to fall back on except papal encyclicals, which, you know, really don't work in a Protestant culture of the parliamentary system of Britain. So, you know, fantastic. There's something to think about, a communitarian discourse, but it's a non-starter. So who do we look at? Well, you know, as I say, maybe it is the Tocquevilles, the Durkheims, the sociological tradition. Dare I say, even possibly Marx in some of the ways in which one can read Marx. You know, those on the right read Marx as being, you know, onto something here. You know, give up all the rubbish about revolution, but the analysis of modernity is something that you know, can inform us. You know, so long as you don't have to worry about the Communist Party and the Leninist version, you can get something out of that. And it's interesting to see, you know, that it's that tradition, that more sort of sociological tradition of big thinking that's the way forward.
Yeah, I thought you wanted to come and read Marx. You'll enjoy that, I'm sure.
I put that in, especially.
Now, we ought to finish in 1 minute. This clock is running a bit slow. Any advice on the reading list for those looking at the reading list?
Okay. I thought long and hard about this. I mean, I would read some of the suggested ideological stuff at the end, but I just think there's one essay in Oakeshott's Rationalism of Politics. Well, there's two. There's always two. There's always more than one. Okay, Political Education, which was his inaugural lecture here, where he takes over from recently deceased Harold Lasky. The second is this question about the study of politics in a university, and it comes to these very important questions about you know, what is political science, you know, naturalism versus history versus all the kinds of things that Matt will wrestle with, and think about, you know, how that connects to the real world of politics. So those two things would be my recommendation.
First, I'd like to thank Paul Kelly very much for an excellent exposition of his. He's laid the ground very well for next week when we're hearing about the Constitution, where some of the ideas we've heard about today will be explained by Professor Martin Laughlin, looking at British constitutional arrangements. So look forward to seeing you all again then. Thank you very much.